Sometimes the smallest knock at the door leads to the greatest turning point in a person's life. She had a name that opened every door he had calloused, hands that fixed the ones falling off their hinges. When a poor mechanic showed up at an old estate to fix a basement leak, he thought it was just another routine job. But what he found waiting behind that grand wooden door was something far more human, far more fragile, and far more unforgettable. This is not just a story about a house or a pipe or even a past. It's a story about timing, about second chances, and about what happens when two very different lives quietly collide and decide not to walk away. If you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and remind us what truly matters, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you won't miss a single chapter. Now, let's begin. A poor mechanic came to fix the basement leak. The heiress said, "That's not why I called you." The phone rang just after sunrise, long before Jack Harper usually stirred from his creaky twin bed, tucked into the back room of his modest garage. The call display flashed unknown, which usually meant a spammer or a wrong number. But something, maybe instinct, maybe the stillness of the morning, made him pick up. "Is this Jack Harper?" A woman's voice asked, smooth but distant, like she'd been trained to speak to strangers without giving away too much. "Depends who's asking," Jack said, still groggy. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and rubbed a hand across his stubbled jaw. There was a pause. "Then this is Evelyn Whitmore. I need someone to take a look at a basement leak. A pipe's burst. I think it's an old house. A very old house." Jack blinked at the name Whitmore. That name hadn't echoed through his life in years, not since the Whitmore estate had gone quiet after the old patriarch passed. A sprawling manor set on the edge of town, now mostly hidden behind ivy. "And time I don't do plumbing, not officially," he said, standing now and looking out the window at his snow-dusted pickup. "But I've patched up worse. What's the address?" "You already know it," she replied softly, and then the line clicked dead. By 9:30, Jack's truck pulled into the long-forgotten driveway of Whitmore Manor. The iron gates were rusted but ajar. The house, once the pride of the region, looked like a page torn from another century. Towering chimneys, arched windows, and walls overgrown with wild vines that wrapped around the brick like memory. The gravel crunched under his boots as he stepped out, toolbox in hand. Snow still lingered in the shadows beneath the porch, and the air smelled of pine and cold stone. He was halfway up the steps when the door creaked open. She stood framed in the threshold, a silhouette against the warm gold light of the grand foyer. Evelyn Whitmore. Not a name anymore, but a presence. She wore a cream wool coat belted at the waist and a silk scarf, the color of winter roses, draped loosely around her neck. Her dark hair, streaked faintly with silver near the temples, was pulled back in a low bun. "Harper," she greeted him, her eyes studying him. Not with scrutiny, but recognition. "Thank you for coming. I'm just here for the leak," Jack said, shifting his weight awkwardly. Her lips curved slightly. "Are you?" He stared at her, brow furrowed. She turned on her heel and gestured for him to follow. The basement's this way. Inside the house was a strange mix of grandeur and neglect. Dust floated like ghosts through tall windows, catching light that filtered through the sheer curtains. The walls were lined with faded portraits, the furniture covered in white sheets like forgotten memories. Jack followed her down a narrow staircase into the basement. The air grew cooler and damper with each step. At the bottom, a single bulb cast a weak glow over cracked cement floors and old wooden beams. "There," she said, pointing toward a darkened corner where moisture had bloomed across the stone wall. He set down his toolbox and knelt, pressing a hand to the wall. The leak was real, subtle but persistent. Water traced silent lines down the brick, gathering in a shallow puddle at the base. "I can patch this for now, but it'll need a full seal job in the spring. This foundation's seen better days. I imagine everything here has." Evelyn said, her voice softer now, as if she wasn't talking about the house. He looked up at her. She was staring not at the wall, but at him, studying the curve of his shoulders, the wear on his boots, the quiet in his eyes. "I remember you," she said suddenly. "You were 17. You used to work summers for my grandfather, in the carriage house. You fixed a broken lawn tractor and helped my mother carrying groceries." Jack leaned back on his heels, blinking. "That was a long time ago. You pulled me out of an old Cadillac in the garage," she added. "I was 6. I'd climbed inside and locked the door. I couldn't figure out how to get out. I screamed until I lost my voice. A faint memory stirred sunlight filtered through dust. The muffled sobbing of a scared little girl. The rusty creak of a door handle stuck shut. He remembered the panic in her tiny eyes and the way she clung to his shirt as he carried her out. "I gave you my handkerchief," he muttered. "I'd forgotten that I didn't," she said quietly. "I kept it for a while, until it smelled too much like the garage and not enough like kindness." Jack stood brushing the dust from his jeans. He didn't know what to say to that. He hadn't thought about the Whitmores in years, not since their parties stopped filling the streets with laughter and limousines. So he said finally, "Why call me for this?" Evelyn's gaze met his steady and clear, because the house needed someone who wouldn't just fix the leak and leave someone who would remember what it once was. Someone real. Jack shifted uncomfortably, unsure if he felt flattered or tricked. "I don't do sentimentality," he said. "I'm a mechanic, not a time traveler. And I'm not looking for a contractor," she replied. "I'm just looking." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by crumbling mortar and echoing memories. Then Jack exhaled through his nose, picked up his wrench and said, "Well, let's start with the leak." The morning light was changing by the time Jack Harper stepped back out of the basement, his hands damp from the stone wall, and his thoughts muddied by a memory he hadn't planned on resurrecting. Upstairs, the manor exhaled stillness. No hum of appliances, no ticking clock, just the quiet creak of old floorboards and the long shadows cast by tall windows. He paused at the threshold of the foyer, wiping his palms on a rag. Evelyn stood by the fireplace, one arm crossed lightly over her stomach, the other holding a chipped mug of something steaming. She looked like she didn't belong there, and yet more than that, like she was trying to belong. Her clothes were expensive but understated. Her heels had been replaced with suede flats, and there was something in her face, some tired trace of loss that softened the edges of her polished demeanor. Jack cleared his throat. "It's a small leak for now. Nothing's collapsed yet, but you'll want to reinforce the southern wall before spring thaw. Water's seeping in from outside." Evelyn nodded, then offered him the mug in her hand. "It's coffee," she said, "but I won't lie, it's terrible. I haven't figured out the old percolator." Jack hesitated, then took it. The mug was warm and awkward in his calloused hands. "Thanks." They sat in silence, her perched on the edge of a velvet armchair, he leaning against the doorframe like a man with somewhere else to be, but no rush to get there. "I honestly didn't think you'd come," she said eventually. "You're not listed in the phone book, had to ask around." "Most people don't," Jack replied. "Call me. I mean, there's younger guys now. Flashier trucks, fewer miles in their eyes." Evelyn's eyes studied him. "You have something they don't." Jack glanced up, skeptical. "You stayed," she said simply. He didn't answer. The coffee was lukewarm and bitter. He took another sip anyway. Outside the manor, a wind had picked up bare branches scratched against the windows, like they remembered a different season. Evelyn stood and walked toward one of them, brushing aside a lace curtain to look out over the sprawling lawn. "I used to sit in that window as a girl," she murmured. "Back when the gardens were kept and the fountains ran in summer, I'd imagine horses galloping across the hills or my mother waiting by the gate with a picnic." Jack followed her gaze. The gardens now were a tangle of dead vines and cracked stone. Beauty forgotten but not erased. "What happened?" he asked, not rudely. Just honestly. Evelyn kept her back to him. "Time happened. Money. My parents divorced quietly but bitterly. Father went to Europe. Mother drank herself into nostalgia. I went to boarding school, then college, then Manhattan." Jack's voice was quiet. "You didn't come back." "Not until the funeral," she said. "Then not again, until now." She turned to face him. Her eyes were dark, thoughtful. "I thought I was done with this place. I thought it had nothing left to give me. But lately, I've been thinking, maybe it's not about what this place can give. Maybe it's about what I never gave it." Jack didn't speak right away. There was something about the way she stood, elegant but weary, that made him hesitate to intrude on her vulnerability. So he said instead, "You came back to fix what's broken." Evelyn gave a soft, almost bitter laugh. "You're the only thing I've fixed so far." He raised an eyebrow. "The pipe," she clarified, smiling faintly. "I mean the pipe." He chuckled, shaking his head. She led him toward the rear hallway, past an arched doorway that once led to the ballroom. The parquet floors creaked underfoot, and the wallpaper was peeling like a memory someone had tried to paint over. At the far end, a door opened into the old conservatory, glass walls dusted with years of neglect, but still letting in long beams of light. "This was my favorite room," she said. "I used to lie on that bench and pretend I could hear the plants growing." Jack looked around. Ferns had long since withered. Pots were cracked. A single vine had grown wild, reaching toward the ceiling. Clinging to the light, I came back. Evelyn continued, "Not for the house, but for the silence. For something that doesn't scream or sell or pretend to know me better than I know myself." Jack met her eyes. "That's a rare thing to find." "Especially in New York," she said. "Especially in people," he replied. For a moment, there was only quiet. Then Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in white cloth. She handed it to him gently. Jack unwrapped it, a piece of soft cotton worn thin over the years, creased, faintly stained but intact. He recognized it immediately. "My handkerchief," he said, disbelieving. "I found it in a box of my mother's things," Evelyn said softly. "It was the only thing I kept when I left this house. I didn't even realize I'd packed it." Jack stared down at it, then looked back up. "I don't remember giving it to you. I cried so hard that day," she said. "And you didn't say much. You just handed me that and said, 'It's okay to cry. Just don't get stuck in it.' I don't think I ever thanked you." Jack's voice was low. "I was 17. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. But you showed up." She said, "That's more than most people ever did." He looked down at the cloth again, folding it gently back into the white wrapping. "You didn't have to call me for this," he said finally. "No," she agreed, "I didn't." He raised an eyebrow. "I called you," Evelyn said, "because I needed someone who remembered me before I forgot myself." Jack didn't know what to say to that. He didn't have the tools to fix a heart that had spent years in exile, but he knew how to hold space for things that were breaking. He'd done it with engines, with houses, with people who'd walked away from everything and needed someone to say, "It's not beyond repair." He looked around the room once more at the broken windows, the light filtering through dust, the ghost of something tender and unfinished. Then he said quietly, "I'll bring better tools tomorrow." Jack returned the next morning before the frost had lifted from the porch steps. His breath fogged in the air as he climbed from the cab of his truck, toolbox in one hand, thermos of strong coffee in the other. The house stood just as still as before, like time had wrapped itself in wool and settled there for the winter. The same brittle ivy clung to the stone, like a secret no one dared disturb. He tapped gently on the front door with the back of his knuckle. No one answered. He waited, listening to the wind shift through the trees, the soft hush of snow melting into the gutters. Then the door creaked open. Evelyn stood barefoot on the tile, wrapped in a gray cardigan over her silk nightdress. Her hair was loose this time, falling softly over one shoulder like a quiet confession. "You're early," she said, blinking, sleep from her eyes. "You're barefoot," he replied without missing a beat. She smiled faintly. "I forgot how cold this house gets in the morning." Jack stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "I brought coffee." She led him into the kitchen where yesterday's sun had given way to a gentler gray light. The counters were cluttered with half-unpacked boxes, china wrapped in newspaper, old glass jars, a bundle of tarnished silverware tied with blue ribbon. The stove looked like it hadn't been used in years, but a kettle sat on it as if it might remember how. "I've been trying to find the past in cardboard," she said, gesturing toward the chaos. "Turns out the past smells a lot like mothballs and dust." Jack poured her a cup from the thermos. "Sometimes the past isn't in the things we kept. It's in what we didn't know we were missing." Evelyn took the cup fingers, brushing his for the briefest second. "Like that handkerchief," he nodded. "That was real cotton, you know. Not like the stuff they make now. I only had two. I gave you the clean one." She laughed softly, and the sound filled the kitchen like warm light. "I remember it smelled like soap and motor oil. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever touched." Jack leaned against the counter. "You were just a kid. Scared out of your mind, I was." She agreed. "And you were this quiet boy who never spoke unless someone needed something fixed. I watched you from the upstairs window sometimes. You always moved like the world was fragile, and you didn't want to break it." Jack looked away, unsure what to say to that. "Do you ever wonder," Evelyn continued, "how some people become a part of us without meaning to?" He met her gaze. "Sometimes I think the people who leave the softest mark are the ones who don't even realize they've touched us." They stood in that gentle hush, the space between them, thick with things unspoken, but not unfamiliar. Later that morning, Jack worked in the basement, carefully scraping away damaged sealant from the old stone wall. Evelyn sat a few feet away on an overturned crate, bundled in a wool coat and holding a flashlight. "I could help, you know," she offered. "You are helping," he said without looking up. "You're holding the light." She tilted the beam toward his hands. "You're good at this. Not just the work?" "The silence, too," Jack chuckled. "Silence is easier than most conversations." "But not this one," she said quietly. He paused, looked at her. "Why now?" he asked. "You've had years to come back. Why this house, this winter, this broken wall?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because I was starting to forget who I was before I became someone else. And you're the last person I remember from that version of me." Jack sat back on his heels. "I'm no anchor." "Evelyn." "No," she said. "You're something rarer. You're a witness." That word hung in the air like breath in cold weather, visible, fleeting, true. "I think we all want someone to remember us," she added. "Not the polished parts. The parts that cracked first." Jack returned to the wall, quietly smoothing fresh sealant into the crevices. "It's easier to fix a wall than a person. But both take time," she said. "And patience. And someone who doesn't walk away when the damage shows." He didn't answer, but his hands never stopped moving. By mid-afternoon, they moved to the conservatory. Jack wanted to inspect the floorboards beneath the old planter boxes, which had buckled from years of moisture and neglect. Evelyn followed him like a shadow, close enough to feel the weight of his presence, far enough not to intrude. Sunlight streamed through the dust-streaked glass painting, golden lines across the ruined wood. Evelyn stood in one of them, hands in her coat pockets, looking like she belonged in a painting no one had finished. "My father wanted to turn this into a ballroom," she said the view would impress donors. "I wanted a greenhouse. Who won? He died before it happened," she replied, "which means nobody won." Jack tapped the boards with a metal rod, listening to the hollow thud of rot. "I could rip these out." "Replace them?" Evelyn smiled. "Or maybe we let them be. Not every broken thing has to be restored. Some of it just needs to be remembered." Jack gave her a long look. "You sound like someone who's been doing a lot of remembering lately." "I have," she admitted, "and also a lot of forgetting." He nodded slowly. "It's strange, isn't it, how some places trap memories and others set them free." She stepped closer now, just a few feet from him. "This house has done both." Jack glanced toward the tall glass windows, the creeping ivy outside, the faded paint on the doors. "This place is still standing," he said. "So are you." Evelyn smiled at him, but this time it reached her eyes. "And so are you, Jack Harper." They didn't speak much after that. He continued checking boards, pointing out cracks she hadn't noticed. She listened, asked questions, took notes in a small leather journal she hadn't shown him before. It felt comfortable. Not like old friends, not like strangers. Like something unfolding slowly, carefully, with no rush to name it. As the afternoon light dimmed, Evelyn walked him to the door. "Tomorrow?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Tomorrow." She opened the door and cold air swept in like a curtain. Jack paused on the threshold. "Evelyn, yes, that handkerchief." "Keep it." "I already did." The third morning came with low clouds and a steady drizzle, the kind that softened the edges of the world and made everything feel more intimate. Somehow Jack parked under the sweeping branches of a maple tree, its limbs still bare, but full of quiet promise. Rain tapped gently on the windshield as he cut the engine. He reached for the thermos beside him and took a long sip, letting the warmth fill the silence in his chest. There was something about this job, this house, this woman that refused to stay routine. He grabbed his toolbox and stepped into the mist. The Whitmore Manor looked different in the rain, less grand, more human. The ivy shone slick against the stone, and the old brass doorknob turned under his hand with a reluctant groan. Inside, the warmth of the entryway greeted him not from the thermostat, which was unreliable at best, but from the faint scent of cinnamon and orange peel drifting through the halls. "Back again," Evelyn said as he stepped inside. She was dressed in a soft flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, with a pencil tucked behind one ear and a notepad in her hand. The kind of outfit that might have looked like a costume on someone else, but on her, it looked like a woman trying to remember what it felt like to live. You started without me, Jack said, nodding toward the pages in her hand. She smiled, just notes, measurements, half memories. You taking over my job, Evelyn arched a brow. I thought you didn't do sentimentality, Mr. Harper, Jack chuckled. I don't. I just don't like being upstaged in my own area of expertise. I promise not to touch your sealant, she said, her voice teasing. But lo, today I just want to look around the old wine cellar. There's a part of the house down there I haven't seen in 20 years. Jack raised an eyebrow. Wine cellar? She nodded. It's through a bricked-up archway. My grandfather sealed it off when I was a girl, said it was unsafe, but I remember it. I used to sneak down there. There were etchings on the walls, my name carved by someone. I want to know if it's still there. He paused. You sure it's safe now? No, she said. That's why I brought you. The air in the basement was cooler today and damp in a way that clung to the skin. Jack held the lantern while Evelyn traced her hand along the stone wall, feeling for the line she remembered as a child, the seam where the wall was once open. There she said suddenly, her fingers tapped against a narrow groove hidden behind a stack of rotting crates. This was the arch. I remember the sound it made when I ran my hand along it. Hollow like a breath caught in stone. Jack examined the bricks, knocking gently. She was right, it was hollow behind there. He set the lantern down and got to work carefully, chiseling away the mortar. The sound of metal against stone echoed in the space. Rhythmic and patient, Evelyn sat nearby on a step, hugging her knees, watching him. Did you ever want to leave? She asked, her voice breaking the silence. Jack paused. Leave the town. Yeah, he thought for a moment, wiping dust from his fingers. When I was a kid, sure thought I'd be an engineer. Build bridges, go west. But then my mom got sick and my little brother was too young to do much. So, I stayed. She nodded. That's a rare thing. Choosing to stay, it didn't feel like a choice at the time. And now Jack met her eyes. Now it feels like it mattered. The final brick gave way, with a low groan, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The air inside was thick, stale, with disuse, but the walls still stood strong. Evelyn stepped through, first lantern in hand. The room beyond was smaller than she remembered, with shelves still lined with ancient dust-covered bottles. Spiderwebs clung to every corner, and the scent of old wood and stone hung heavy in the air. On the far wall, carved into the plaster beneath the window slit, were faint initials. WHJH, Evelyn gasped. They're still here. Jack stepped beside her. Who's WH? My father, she said softly. Whitmore Harrison. He used to hide down here when my mother would start throwing things. Said this place was cooler than anywhere upstairs. Jack traced a calloused finger across the third set of initials. Jeshuna H, he murmured. This wasn't here before Evelyn turned to him. Jack Harper, he shrugged. I must have carved it back when I worked here. Maybe the same day I found you in that car. She looked at the wall, then at him. Why would you carve your name down here? Jack paused, hand still resting against the stone. I guess I wanted to leave a mark somewhere, even if no one would ever see it. She stared at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then she stepped closer. You know, I always thought I was the only one hiding in this house. Turns out I wasn't. No, Jack said, voice low. You weren't. They sat on the dusty floor for a while. After that, backs against the wall, knees nearly touching Evelyn, wrapped her arms around herself as if she could fold memory into her bones. My parents weren't unkind, she said quietly. They were just too loud in the wrong ways. Always performing, always worrying about appearances. No one ever sat still long enough to ask if I was okay. Jack nodded, eyes fixed on a crack in the far wall. I know that kind of house. Evelyn looked over. Did you ever get asked once or twice, he said. But mostly I just learned to stop waiting for the question. She leaned her head against the wall. Sometimes I think I've spent my whole adult life trying to answer a question. No one ever asked. Jack turned toward her. And sometimes, he said, we're just looking for someone who notices we're still trying. Their eyes met again. This time neither looked away. By the time they climbed back upstairs, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the world silver and soft. Light spilled through the conservatory windows like a promise. Evelyn turned to Jack as he packed up his tools. "Thank you for today," she said. He nodded. "You gonna carve anything new down there?" She smiled that quiet smile he was beginning to recognize. "Maybe, but this time I'll leave space beside it." Jack looked at her. Really looked. And for a moment it felt like they weren't standing in an old house or sifting through the past, but building something neither of them had expected. "Tomorrow?" she asked, almost hopeful. "Yeah," Jack said, pausing at the door. "Tomorrow." By the end of the week, their rhythm had become something almost sacred. Jack would arrive with his thermos and toolbox, each morning just past 8. Evelyn would greet him sometimes with a flannel thrown hastily over a nightgown, other times already dressed in soft sweaters and wool slacks, notebook in hand like she was preparing for a lecture. Only she would hear. They worked side by side, no contract, no timeline, no promises. Just two people carefully peeling back layers of a house, and in ways neither could admit out loud of themselves. That Friday the sun came out for the first time in days. It lit the windows of the conservatory with a golden sheen, casting stripes of warmth across the floorboards Jack had just begun to replace. "I forgot what this room looked like with real light," Evelyn said, setting down a tray with two mismatched plates, grilled cheese sandwiches halved carefully, and a bowl of apple slices dusted with cinnamon. Jack looked up from his crouch near the window. "Didn't take you for the domestic type." "I'm not," she admitted, "but I can burn a sandwich with heart." He laughed. "As long as you don't burn the house, we'll be fine." They ate on the floor, no table. No ceremony, just the two of them sitting with their backs against the wall, legs stretched out into the warm spill of sun. Dust floated through the air, caught in golden shafts. For a while there was only the crunch of toast, the occasional clink of a mug, and the hum of an old house beginning to breathe again. Evelyn broke the silence first. "Did you ever fall in love?" Jack paused mid-chew. "You're not one for small talk, are you? I figure we've shared basements and childhood traumas. Might as well talk about love." He set his sandwich down, brushed the crumbs from his fingers. "Yeah, once. Her name was Claire. We were engaged for about 6 months." Evelyn looked at him, but didn't speak. "She left when my mom's illness got worse." He continued, "Said she wasn't built for that kind of life. Said I stopped looking at her like she was the future." That must have hurt. It did, but I couldn't blame her. She didn't sign up to be a caregiver. I barely signed up for it myself. Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. "But you stayed." He shrugged. "Someone had to." For a long moment the only sound was the chirp of birds outside, returning cautiously with the sunlight. "What about you?" he asked. She traced a fingertip along the edge of her plate. "I was supposed to marry a man named Grant. Investment banker, polished, well-spoken. My parents adored him. But I didn't." Jack gave a soft grunt of understanding. "He liked the idea of me," she said, "but not the reality. The quiet, the questions, the parts I didn't decorate." Jack looked at her thoughtfully. "Sounds like you dodged a bullet, I suppose," she said, half smiling. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm just hard to love." He didn't respond right away. Then he said quietly, "No one is hard to love, just easy to misunderstand." Evelyn blinked, and for a moment her expression flickered somewhere between gratitude and the ache of recognition. That she said is probably the kindest thing anyone said to me in 10 years. That afternoon they worked on stripping the wallpaper in the parlor. Beneath the layers, the original plaster was surprisingly intact. Marbled with time but still strong. As Jack peeled away a wide section, Evelyn stood behind him, arms folded, studying the exposed wall. "My mother used to throw parties in here," she said. "Black tie, string quartet, past hors d'oeuvres. You couldn't move without being handed a glass of something expensive." Jack turned to her. "And where were you? Hiding in the kitchen, eating crackers, with the caterer's son." He grinned. "Now that sounds like the best part of the night." "It was," she admitted. "He taught me how to roll silverware like a pro." Jack stepped back and looked at her. "You remember things with such clarity." She nodded. "When you feel invisible, you learn to observe. It's how I protected myself." Watching instead of being, Jack looked down at the roll of wallpaper curled at his feet. "Maybe that's why this place called you back. It remembered being seen." She tilted her head. "And maybe it called you too." He didn't answer that. Instead he asked, "You ever think of staying here?" Evelyn seemed surprised by the question. Staying like moving back for good? Jack shrugged. Seems like you've done more than just visit. She looked around the room, eyes softening. I came thinking it would be a funeral. A letting go, but now? I don't know. Maybe it's more of a beginning. Jack met her gaze, or a rebuilding. They stood there for a moment in the middle of an old parlor stripped to its bones, surrounded by history and the bare walls of something new. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. When the afternoon shadows lengthened and the sun dipped just below the treetops, Jack packed his tools in quiet motions. Evelyn walked him to the door as she always did. Before he stepped out, she touched his arm lightly. You'll come tomorrow. Jack paused, then nodded. Yeah, I will. She offered him a smile. It wasn't a smile for company. It wasn't polished or prepared. It was real, worn in. The kind people only give when they've stopped pretending. As he walked back to his truck, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the ivy on the stone. Jack paused halfway down the path and turned back. Evelyn stood in the open doorway, framed in the fading light. Neither of them waved, but both lingered long enough to know that something had shifted. Something small, something real. The town of Marlow was the kind of place where news didn't travel. It seeped like water through old brick, finding every crack and widening it quietly over time. By Monday morning, the gas station clerk raised an eyebrow when Jack paid for his coffee. "You've been working up at the Whitmore place, huh?" Jack nodded, noncommittal. Pretty thing that Evelyn the clerk added with a smirk. Not bad company for a guy who fixes mufflers. Jack didn't respond. He left the change on the counter and walked out without another word, but it continued. At the diner, the waitress handed him his usual breakfast sandwich with a wink. "Tell her we're all rooting for you. Rich girls in pickup trucks always makes for a good story." At first, Jack let it slide. Small towns had small minds. He'd known that since he was a boy with calloused hands before he had a beard. But by midweek, it had gotten under his skin. He returned to the Whitmore estate with a knot in his chest and a weight he couldn't name. The manor looked unchanged, serene, dignified. But that morning it felt like walking into a theater mid-scene, uncertain of who was watching. Evelyn met him in the entry hall, wearing a soft olive-green sweater that brought out the quiet hue of her eyes. She smiled, but it faded the moment she saw his face. "What happened?" Jack set his toolbox down harder than he meant to. "Did you tell anyone I've been working here?" She frowned. "No, why? Because everyone else seems to know." Evelyn crossed her arms. "It's a small town. Jack, people talk." "Yeah," he said more sharply than he intended. "And they're not just talking about plumbing." There was a pause, the kind that cracks not because of volume, but because of all the things that were never meant to be spoken aloud. Evelyn's voice lowered. "What exactly are they saying? That I've finally found my golden ticket? That I'm fixing more than just your pipes?" She stared at him, hurt flickering in her expression, like a curtain caught in a draft. "Do you think that's what I'm doing? Stringing you along for amusement?" Jack looked away, jaw tight. "I don't know what you're doing, Evelyn. You call me here to fix a leak that didn't exist. You keep me working on a house. You say you might sell, might stay in. You bring me lunch and ask about my past. I'm not used to women like you paying attention to men like me, unless there's a punchline coming." She stepped back, her voice quieter now. "And what kind of woman do you think I am?" Jack sighed. "I don't know. That's the problem." Silence filled the grand old hallway again. Even the house seemed to still waiting to see what would break. Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I didn't think people still defined others by where they stood in the world." Jack gave a bitter smile. "In towns like this, that's all they do." "I called you," she said softly, "because I remembered the boy who showed up when I needed help, who didn't ask questions, who gave me a handkerchief and sat with me until I could stop shaking. I thought maybe he'd still be there." Jack's voice was tight. "He is, but he's not 17 anymore. He's been through a few things. Learn not to mistake warmth for something more." She looked up. Then maybe I was wrong to call. Jack didn't answer. He picked up his toolbox and turned toward the basement. The rest of the day passed in near silence. They worked in the same rooms but stayed oceans apart. When Evelyn offered him coffee, he accepted it but didn't linger. When she spoke, he nodded but didn't reply. The rhythm they'd built, those soft pauses and shared glances, had slipped from their grasp like a dropped thread in a tapestry. And yet beneath the surface, something else pulsed. Not anger, not rejection, but confusion. Wounded trust unsure where to land. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the high windows, Jack stood alone in the old library, staring at the soot-darkened hearth. This room, like so much of the house, had once been alive. The shelves still held books with cracked spines and gold-embossed titles. The faint scent of leather and wood smoke lingered like someone had just stepped out and left the fire burning. He ran a hand along the edge of the mantel, fingertips brushing against initials carved into the wood, E+W. Beneath it faintly, 1989. A child's declaration in soft curves, Evelyn stepped into the doorway behind him, her voice quiet. I used to read in here for hours. When the house got loud upstairs, he turned and for the first time that day met her eyes. I didn't mean to accuse you, he said. It's just, I don't always know how to be looked at without a reason. I'm not used to people seeing me without a price tag. Evelyn stepped into the room, her arms wrapped around herself. And I'm not used to being seen for anything but one. They stood facing each other, not touching, not reaching, but recognizing. Do you think it's possible she asked for two people from different sides of a cracked wall to meet in the middle? Jack looked down at the initials on the mantel. Only if they're willing to stop pretending the wall isn't there. I'm not pretending, she said. I see it. I just don't want to climb it alone. His voice was low. I don't know if I have it in me to climb again. Last time I did, the fall damn near broke me. Her smile was faint but real. Maybe this time no one's falling. Jack exhaled slowly, the fight in him softening. Then maybe, he said, we should keep building from both sides. She stepped forward just enough to close a little of the distance. Starting tomorrow. He nodded. Yeah, tomorrow. That evening as Jack drove home, he didn't turn on the radio. The road wound like a ribbon through fields, half frozen, half thawing. The horizon stretched wide, painted in soft lavender and steel gray. He thought of Evelyn's face in the light from the library window. The rawness, the steadiness. He hadn't been wrong to be cautious, but maybe he'd been wrong to assume the worst. In a town that kept score by bloodlines and balance sheets, maybe two people could still meet, no stage, no spotlight, just human and hurting and trying. And maybe that was enough. Jack didn't return the next day, nor the day after. The house, once filled with the steady cadence of hammering, the rustle of drop cloths, and the quiet ease of conversation, now echoed only Evelyn's footsteps. She moved through the rooms alone, each one feeling larger, hollower than it had before, like it had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe back in. She told herself he needed space, told herself she had pushed too far too fast, but it didn't make the silence easier. On the third morning, she walked down to the basement and stood before the newly patched wall where the leak had once been. The mortar was smooth now, the edges clean. A job well done, but the quiet hum that used to settle there, the comfort of his presence, was gone. And in its place, a strange ache had taken root. She turned away and headed for the garage. It was colder there, the kind of cold that crept into your clothes and stayed. Dust hung in the beams of light, streaming through the small windows, catching on old tools and rusted hinges. Evelyn pulled a heavy tarp off a forgotten shelf and found, to her surprise, a small wooden box tucked beneath it, unlabeled, unassuming. Inside, a stack of faded photographs, an old maintenance log with Jack's father's name scrawled in the margins, and a tarnished Whitmore keychain she vaguely remembered from childhood. Her breath caught when she pulled out the last item, a Polaroid curled at the edges. Two boys, one of them clearly Jack younger. His smile unguarded, standing beside an older man, with grease on his hands and a proud look in his eyes. Behind them, the very garage where she now stood. Her thumb brushed over the image. You've been here longer than I have. She thought, this was your home first. Across town, Jack stood behind the counter of his garage, staring at a carburetor he'd rebuilt twice now. Not because it needed fixing, but because it gave his hands something to do. The bell above the front door jingled, and he didn't even look up. Just a minute, he called out. You said that 10 years ago, came a familiar voice. Jack's head jerked up. Leaning in the doorway was Matt, his younger brother, all long limbs and a flannel too clean to belong to anyone in this garage. He wore the kind of confidence Jack had never fully grown into, probably because Matt had left town, become someone else, while Jack had stayed and kept the lights on. Jack wiped his hands on a rag. "You're early, I was hungry," Matt said. "Figured if I came now you'd buy lunch. Least you can do after I drove 4 hours." Jack gave a reluctant smile. "Still dramatic. Still stubborn," Matt shot back, grinning. They sat in the tiny break room with 2 sandwiches between them, half lukewarm coffee and years of brotherhood folded into the easy pauses between words. So Matt said between bites, "You gonna tell me why you look like you've lost something?" "You never had." Jack leaned back, rubbing a hand across his face. "It's complicated," Matt raised an eyebrow. "She have a name," Jack hesitated, then said, "Evelyn Whitmore." Matt froze mid-chew, as in the Whitmore. Jack nodded. Matt whistled low. "You don't do simple, do you?" Jack shrugged. "It wasn't supposed to be anything. Isn't that always how it starts?" Jack didn't answer right away. He stared down at his coffee, like it held something he hadn't figured out yet. "She remembered me," he said finally. "From when we were kids, brought me back to that house. Said she needed something real. And for a while I believed her." Matt's voice softened. But people talk about her, about me, about what this all means. And I let it get in my head. I said some things I shouldn't have." Matt leaned forward. "Jack, has it occurred to you that maybe she doesn't care what the town thinks?" Jack looked at him. "Maybe she should." Or maybe Matt said carefully, "You're just scared that someone finally saw you, really saw you, and you didn't know what to do with that." The words landed like a truth Jack hadn't wanted to hear. He looked away, jaw clenched. Matt stood, picking up his sandwich. "You've always fixed things. Jack engines pipes problems. Maybe this time what needs fixing isn't just a wall in a basement." That evening, Evelyn stood by the fire in the old library, reading through her father's journals. Most were filled with numbers, stiff language plans for expansions that never came. But near the end of one notebook, scribbled almost like an afterthought, she found a line that stopped her cold. "The Harper boy reminds me of myself. Quiet, determined. A little too serious for his own good. If I had a daughter worth her salt, I'd tell her to marry someone like that." She set the journal down gently, her fingers trembling. Her father had never said those words aloud, but somehow they mattered more now than if he had. The next morning Jack returned. Not with tools, not with coffee, just himself. Evelyn saw him from the window and didn't move. Not at first. She watched as he stepped onto the porch, exhaled like he was letting go of something heavy, and raised his hand to knock. When she opened the door, they stood in silence. Jack spoke first. "I found some old things in the garage. Your father and mine, they worked together longer than I realized." She nodded. "He mentioned you in a journal." He looked surprised. "Said you were the kind of man he hoped I'd notice." Jack swallowed hard. "I shouldn't have said what I said." He murmured, "About you, about why you called me." "That wasn't fair." Evelyn studied him. "You were hurt." He nodded. "Still doesn't excuse it." They stood in the doorway, the morning light casting long shadows behind them. "I'm not asking for anything," Jack said quietly. "Not a do-over, not a promise. I wanted you to know that I'm still here. Not for the job, just..." Here, Evelyn opened the door wider. "Then come in," she said. "We'll start from wherever we are." Jack stepped inside. The house, once filled with silence, seemed to hold its breath, then slowly, gently let it go. The sky was washed in soft gray. The morning Jack returned, the kind of sky that held its breath just before snow or forgiveness. Inside the Whitmore manor, everything was still except for Evelyn. She had been awake since dawn, moving through the house like a quiet current, unsure what she was looking for until she found it. It was a thin, worn envelope hidden behind a false panel in her father's old desk in the study. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, precise, and unmistakably her father's. She hesitated before opening it, as if the weight of its contents could reach across time and rewrite everything. It was addressed simply, "To be opened by Evelyn Whitmore if she ever comes home." Her breath caught. She sat down slowly in the cracked leather armchair beside the window, light pooling on the floor at her feet. "My Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means you came back. I want to say I'm proud of you. But the truth is, I don't know if I've ever said it enough when I had the chance. I made a life out of building things. homes, companies, reputations. But I never quite figured out how to build the thing that mattered most between us. Trust. You were always stronger than I gave you credit for. Quieter than your mother, but wiser in a way that unsettled me. You asked questions I didn't want to answer about why things mattered, about what made a life worthwhile. I don't know if you remember the Harper boy Jack. He worked for us one summer. He was no more than 17, but I saw something in him even then, a steadiness, a kind of dignity no money can buy. He reminded me of myself before the world told me what success was supposed to look like. His father was a good man, humble, proud in the quiet way real men are. When your mother took ill that fall and you wandered off, it was his father who found you by the lake. He carried you all the way back and never asked for thanks. I owed that family more than I ever admitted. I never paid the debt. Maybe you can, or maybe this isn't about debts at all. If Jack Harper is still in this town, and if by some twist of fate your paths have crossed again, don't look away. Don't let the past stop you from choosing differently. Dad. Evelyn didn't cry, not exactly. The tears didn't fall like they had when she buried her mother or when Grant walked out the door with his suitcase and perfect suits. This was different, the kind of ache that sits behind your ribs and softens you, even as it breaks something open. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the front pocket of her sweater, and went to find Jack. He was in the conservatory, kneeling beside a pile of tools he'd unpacked without a word. He glanced up when she entered but didn't speak. There was no need. Evelyn walked over, knelt beside him, and handed him the letter. His brow furrowed as he opened it. She watched his eyes move line by line, his expression unreadable but intent. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, the letter resting loosely in his hands. "He never said a word to me," Jack murmured. "Not once. I thought your father didn't even know I existed." "He knew," Evelyn said softly. "He just didn't know how to say it out loud." Jack ran a hand through his hair. "My father carried you from the lake." She nodded. "I was 7. I barely remember. Just that I was cold and lost, and then suddenly I wasn't." Jack let out a quiet breath. "He died before I ever asked him about any of it. I thought I knew everything there was to know about him. Turns out he had his own stories." "They all do," Evelyn said. "Parents. They carry their regrets in places they think will never look." Jack looked at her, then really looked. "You're not your parents, Evelyn." "No," she said, "but I've been afraid of becoming them for a long time." He reached out gently, brushing a speck of dust from her cheek with the back of his knuckle. "You're not." They worked together for the next hour, mostly in silence, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer weighed down by the fear of saying the wrong thing. Instead, it held the quiet comfort of shared understanding. Not perfect, but real. Jack fixed the last of the cracked panes in the conservatory. Evelyn swept the broken glass into a rusted dustpan and threw it away without ceremony. Afterward, they sat on the old bench beneath the tall windows, the winter light casting long golden slants across the floor. Evelyn pulled the letter back from her pocket and ran her thumb along the folded crease. "He said I could choose differently," she said quietly. Jack didn't respond right away. "Then do you want to?" She turned to him. "What if I do? But I don't know how yet." Jack smiled gently. "Then we start small." She blinked. Like maybe he said, "You come by my shop next week. Help me organize some shelves." She tilted her head. "You want me to alphabetize spark plugs?" "No," he said deadpan, "but I want to see you in my world for a change, not just here in the shadow of yours." She smiled. "Okay, but I'm wearing heels," he chuckled. "Then I'm buying knee pads." The sun was sinking low when Jack packed up to leave. At the door, he hesitated. "I don't know what this is," he said, "or where it's going. But I know it doesn't feel like a job anymore." Evelyn nodded, heart steady. It never was. They stood in that quiet moment where decisions become memories. Then Jack leaned forward and kissed her forehead. Not with urgency, not as a promise, but as a beginning. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. Evelyn nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Tomorrow. Outside, the sky was painted with soft streaks of lavender and rose. Inside, Evelyn stood in the doorway, with her hand over her heart, the folded letter still warm in her pocket, and the weight of generations slowly lifting from her shoulders. She didn't know exactly what the future would bring, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to find out. The dining room hadn't been used in years. Its long walnut table sat beneath a tarnished chandelier, the crystals still catching light but dulled with time. The wallpaper, once gold with silver detailing, had faded into muted ochres and soft grays, like the memory of a celebration that no one quite recalled. But tonight Evelyn lit candles anyway. She moved quietly through the room, brushing dust from the backs of the chairs, placing simple white dishes on woven placemats. No crystal, no sterling, silver, just what she'd found in a half-open box in the pantry. A meal not meant to impress, but to honor something that had taken root without either of them meaning to. She checked the pot roast in the oven one last time. Her mother's recipe, though she'd never once seen her cook it. Evelyn had spent the afternoon with a cookbook propped open on the counter, her sleeves rolled up and forehead streaked with flour, laughing to herself when the carrots fell in too early, or the onions refused to brown. But the house smelled good now, like thyme and rosemary and warm bread. And when Jack knocked at 7 sharp, the scent greeted him before she even opened the door. He stood on the threshold clean-shaven and wearing a dark button-up shirt tucked neatly into his worn jeans. His boots were muddy from the walk up the drive, but his eyes were steady, warmer than they'd been in days. "Hope I'm not underdressed," he said, offering a half-smile. Evelyn stepped aside. "Only if you're expecting linen napkins and wine pairings." He glanced around as he entered. "This place, it feels different." She nodded. "So do I." They sat at opposite ends of the long table, at first laughing at how formal it looked. "This was the table where my parents hosted senators and CEOs," Evelyn said, slicing a piece of bread. "They'd spend more time posturing than eating. Once my father forgot I was at the table until dessert." Jack glanced down the long stretch of mahogany between them. "Would you rather sit closer?" She smiled, stood and carried her plate to the chair beside his. "There," she said, settling in beside him. "Now it's just dinner." The food was imperfect, some bites too salty, others a little bland, but Jack cleaned his plate like it was the best thing he'd had in weeks. Evelyn ate slowly, watching him between bites, still not used to how easily he occupied space when he didn't mean to. Afterward, they lingered at the table, sipping tea from mismatched mugs, the fire in the adjacent room casting flickering light across their faces. "You ever think about leaving?" Jack asked, his voice soft. Evelyn looked at him. "Leaving the house. The town." She folded her hands around her cup. "I already did. Spent 20 years trying to outrun this place, but I never really belonged where I went." Jack nodded, looking into the steam rising from his tea. "I've thought about it too," he said, "more when I was younger, when the shop got quiet or the loneliness got loud. But every time I packed a bag, something stopped me. Your mother at first," he said, "then my brother, then habit." She tilted her head, and now Jack looked up. "Now I think maybe there's something here worth staying for." Evelyn's breath caught, but she didn't speak. The silence between them was full, not empty, charged, not heavy. And just as she opened her mouth to speak, Jack leaned back and reached into his jacket pocket. "I brought something," he said, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. "Found it tucked in a maintenance log at the shop. It's a proposal your father had written. For turning this place into a retreat center, he wanted to offer veterans and struggling families a place to stay. Quiet, safe off the radar." Evelyn stared at the paper. Surprised he never mentioned this to me. Jack nodded. "Didn't mention it to many, but it's all laid out here. The design, the cost projections, even a list of names of people he wanted to bring in to help, including my dad." She read through it in silence, fingers trembling just slightly. "He was planning to use this place for good," she whispered. "Not just for appearances." Jack looked at her gently. "Maybe that's why he wanted you to come home. Not to restore what was, but to finish what he started." Evelyn set the paper down slowly. "I thought I came back to let go, but maybe I came back to build something." They sat in silence for a while, the candles burning low. Then, without looking at him, she asked, "Are you still afraid I'll leave?" Jack didn't answer right away. "Not if you're building something," he said at last. "People don't walk away from foundations they've poured themselves. She turned to him, her expression open bare. "And if I asked you to help me build it?" He looked at her. Really looked, and for the first time he didn't hesitate. "I already started." Later that night, Jack stood at the front door, the night air cool and crisp against his skin. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, arms folded over her chest. "This felt like a goodbye," she said softly. Was it? Jack shook his head. No, but it was a turning point. She studied him. "Are you sure?" He reached out, brushed her cheek with the backs of his fingers. "I'm tired of waiting for perfect clarity. All I know is when I'm here, it doesn't feel like I'm passing time anymore." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then stay." Jack leaned in close enough to feel her breath, but didn't kiss her. "Not yet. Tomorrow," he said instead, "we'll draw up plans for the house, for all of it." He stepped into the night boots, crunching softly over gravel headlights, flaring as he turned the truck around. Evelyn watched until the red glow disappeared into the dark. She didn't go back inside right away. She stood there a long time, the night cool on her skin, the scent of thyme and smoke still lingering in her sleeves. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready. The next morning broke with a soft, peach-colored sky. Snow dusted the trees thin and lacy like the first touch of winter's second breath. The world was quiet, hushed, not asleep but listening. Jack arrived earlier than usual. No toolbox, no coffee, just a folded sheet of paper in his pocket and something heavier behind his ribs. He hesitated on the porch. The wood creaked under his boots the same way it always had. But today it felt different, like he was standing not at a threshold but at a crossroads. When Evelyn opened the door, she looked surprised to see him so early. She was barefoot, wrapped in a long cardigan, holding a pencil in her hand, like she'd just stepped away from something unfinished. Her hair was pinned up messily, and her cheeks still carried the softness of sleep. "You're early," she said, voice gentle. Jack nodded. "I needed to be." She stepped back to let him in. They stood in the entryway where light poured through the tall windows and painted gold on the old parquet floors I've been sketching, she said, motioning toward the kitchen table. "Not architectural plans, just ideas. Spaces for people to gather. Quiet corners, a reading room, a porch swing." Jack followed her in and saw a dozen rough pencil drawings scattered across the table. None were polished, but all of them were filled with intention, with care. "They're good," he said, picking one up. "Honest'n." She shrugged a little bashfully. "It's how I think. Not in numbers or blueprints, just feeling my way forward." "That's the only way worth building," he replied, sitting down. They stood over the sketches for a moment before Evelyn turned to him. "You said yesterday was a turning point," she said quietly. "That we draw up plans today, but you didn't bring your tools." Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, handwritten, folded cleanly down the middle. "I brought this instead." He handed it to her. Evelyn unfolded the page and read, "It wasn't a blueprint. It wasn't a proposal. It was a letter. I never learned how to write things that matter, but I know how to fix what breaks, and I know when something is worth staying for. You've reminded me what it feels like to be known, not for what I can repair or how I show up in emergencies, but for who I am in the quiet when the job is done. I don't want to walk through this house only as a guest. I don't want to be someone who shows up just to tighten bolts. I want to help you build what comes next, not just walls and windows, a life, but only if you want that too." Jack, she read it once. Then again, her fingers trembled slightly, and when she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but not from sadness. "From clarity, I do," she whispered. Jack didn't move. "I want that," she continued. "I want something that doesn't have to glitter or impress. Just something true. Something I don't have to perform into existence." Jack stepped closer. "And if I don't have it all figured out yet, I don't want perfect," he said. "I want honest." There was a beat. Then Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible, "Why did you really come today?" Jack hesitated, then said, "Because I had one question I needed to ask." Her eyes searched his. "I thought maybe you needed something fixed again," she said, trying to smile. "I do," he said, "but not in the basement." He pulled a small object from his back pocket, nothing flashy, just a single key. Attached to it was the tarnished Whitmore keychain he'd found in the garage, now cleaned and polished, the initials, WH gleaming faintly. This place was your family's, he said, but your father wanted it to belong to something more. She nodded slowly. I don't need to own it, he continued. I just want to be part of it. With you, Evelyn's breath caught. Jack held the key between them. Will you let me stay? She took it carefully, reverently, like it was something far more precious than property or promise. And then softly, you never had to ask. They walked the property that afternoon, boots crunching through light snow breath visible in the crisp air. Jack pointed out rotted wood along the veranda. Evelyn imagined flower beds and a low stone wall where the wild grass met the orchard. They talked about silly things too, what color the shutters should be, whether the swing should face the lake or the sunrise, whether to keep the old iron bell above the door. By the time they returned to the porch, the sky had deepened to lavender. Evelyn paused on the top step. Can I show you something? Jack nodded. She led him through the front door, up the sweeping staircase, and into the attic, a place neither of them had yet explored together. Dust hung thick in the air, but light filtered in through a round window at the far end, illuminating a trunk in the corner. She knelt and opened it. Inside were stacks of drawings, her childhood sketches, houses, rooms, staircases leading nowhere. But also people, tiny figures with names scrawled in pencil. Mom, Dad, me the boy with the kind hands. She handed one to Jack, a clumsy child's drawing, two stick figures beneath a tree, one offering something to the other. That day she said, you gave me a handkerchief. But what I remembered wasn't the cloth. It was the way you didn't rush me, the way you didn't try to make me stop crying. You just stayed. Jack stared at the drawing. I didn't think it mattered, it did, she said. More than you'll ever know. As the sun dipped low, they returned downstairs and stood in the kitchen where dinner simmered again. This time a simple soup, rosemary and potatoes. Evelyn turned off the burner, then leaned against the counter and looked at him. This house is full of echoes, she said, but I think it's ready for new sounds. Jack smiled. Laughter's a good place to start. Maybe music, she added. Even bad piano playing, I can manage 3 chords, he said. That's something. She reached for his hand. Their fingers laced, no ceremony, no hesitation. Not a promise of perfection, just presence, just beginning. The next few weeks moved like pages turned in quiet reverence. Winter, once harsh and biting, had softened into something almost tender. The snow no longer fell in heavy silences, but in light flurries that painted the trees like lace. The manor, too, had changed, not in structure, not yet, but in spirit. Where once there had been stillness, there was now motion. Where there had been dust, now light danced in corners. Jack and Evelyn worked side by side, not hurried, not cautious, just steady. Some days they cleared rooms that had been closed for decades. Other days they simply made tea and talked in the kitchen, while the wind pressed gently against the windows. They'd begun drawing up real plans for the future of the estate. A retreat, yes, but not just for veterans and families. For teachers, for artists, for people whose lives had cracked quietly without anyone noticing. We'll call it a place for rebuilding, Evelyn had said one morning, tapping her pencil against her notepad. Not as a metaphor, as a way of being. Jack had simply nodded, smiled, and replied, you should put that on the sign. Late one afternoon, after a long day of sanding the old banisters and checking insulation in the attic, Evelyn walked into the front parlor with 2 mugs of hot cider. Jack was standing near the grand fireplace, holding an old photograph in his hands. She walked over and peeked at it. The photo was faded, sepia-toned, a group of workmen outside the manor in the late 1950s, one of whom she immediately recognized. That's your father, she said, pointing. Jack nodded. And yours standing behind him. They stared at the photo for a moment in shared quiet. Funny, isn't it, she murmured. They stood right here before us, carrying hammers and burdens we'll never fully understand. Jack placed the photo carefully back on the mantel, and now it's us building forward. She handed him the mug, their fingers touched briefly, warm, familiar. I keep thinking, Evelyn said, how strange it is that this house held so much pain. And yet it was waiting, like it knew we'd be the ones to give it another chance. Jack looked around the room. The wallpaper was still peeling. The floors creaked. The ceiling had water stains from storms long past. But it was beautiful because she was in it, because they were in it together. Do you ever wonder, she asked, if you hadn't come to fix that non-existent leak, if we would have met again some other way? Jack smiled into his cider. No, I think life's a bit less poetic than that. I think people walk past each other all the time, and the timing has to be just right. He paused, or maybe he added, the house really did call me. Evelyn laughed, and the sound filled the room like a song returning to a place that had long forgotten music. The next morning, Jack arrived just after dawn, this time not in work clothes. He wore a dark coat, clean jeans, and a button-up shirt she hadn't seen before, one that still held the sharp crease of something kept in the back of a closet, waiting for a day that might matter. Evelyn was standing in the foyer, barefoot, brushing her hair back as she opened the door. She blinked at him, surprised. "You're not here to work." "Not today," he said. He held up a brown paper bag and a thermos. "Breakfast, and thought you might like to eat it on the porch." She smiled. "Let me grab a sweater." They sat together on the wide front steps, eating buttered toast wrapped in cloth napkins and sipping cinnamon coffee while the sky turned from gold to blue. The trees were dusted in white, but the sun had begun to melt the frost at the tips. A cardinal hopped from branch to branch, its red feathers striking against the quiet landscape. They didn't speak for a while. Then Evelyn turned to him, her voice soft. "Why today?" Jack set down his cup. "Because I've been waiting for a moment that didn't feel borrowed." He looked at her, his eyes steady, "And today feels like it's ours." She looked at him, really looked, and the weight of those weeks, those years before them, seemed to lift. Not everything had been said, but everything had changed. Later that afternoon, they returned to the basement, their basement. Now Jack rolled up his sleeves and started measuring a new section of the foundation where they'd eventually pour concrete for the retreat wing. Evelyn stood nearby, sketching in her notebook, when he suddenly paused. "What?" she asked, peering over. He pointed toward the old brick wall they'd uncovered weeks ago, the one with the initials EWWHJH. Only now something new was etched beside them. A fresh set of letters, TBD. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "To be determined," Jack grinned. "Well, I figured we'd leave some space." She walked over and traced the new letters with her fingertip, her expression softening. "I like that," she said. "Like we're not done yet." He stood behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "We're not," he whispered. "Not even close." That night the manor glowed, not with chandeliers or crystal light fixtures, but with small lamps, candles on windowsills, and laughter echoing from the kitchen, where Evelyn burned a second batch of cornbread and Jack offered to fix the smoke alarm she'd dismantled just temporarily. They sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor, a bowl of popcorn between them, the sound of an old vinyl crackling from the other room. Neither one spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The house was no longer silent. It had found its voice again, and so had they. Spring arrived slowly in Marlowe, like someone waking from a long healing sleep. The last of the frost slipped quietly from the fields, and daffodils began poking up near the old fence line behind the Whitmore estate. Birds returned in small tentative flocks, and for the first time in years, the manor didn't feel like a relic. It felt like a home. Evelyn stood at the top of the basement steps, sleeves rolled, hair braided, wearing a faded t-shirt that read, "Property of no one, a gift from Jack, half joke, half truth." Her boots were muddy and her hands were already speckled with paint. Jack was below, kneeling on the concrete using a crowbar to carefully pry up one of the damaged floor panels near the far wall. "You're about to hit the nail bed," Evelyn called down, watching him with a smile. "Thanks, Foreman," he replied without looking up. "When this project wins an award, I'll make sure your name is spelled right." She laughed, then climbed down the light from the newly installed basement windows, falling in warm shafts across the floor. The room no longer felt damp or forgotten. They'd torn out old insulation, patched cracked stone, painted the beams a soft white. In one corner, the framing for a future reading nook had gone up. In another, a sketch of a children's art table was taped to the wall. They had named it the Hearth Room, a space for restoration, for stories, for starting again. Jack straightened and wiped sweat from his brow. "That's the last of the old boards. We'll start laying the new flooring next week." Evelyn nodded. "And once that's done, we open the doors." He looked at her. "Are you ready?" She thought about that for a moment. She'd spent years chasing certainty, titles, approval, clean lines, and pre-approved futures. But now standing in the quiet heart of a house that had nearly collapsed under its own silence, she realized she didn't need certainty. She needed purpose. She needed to belong not to a name or a legacy, but to something real. "I'm ready," she said. Jack smiled and reached for her hand. "Then let's finish it together." A week later, the first gathering at Whitmore House took place. Not a ribbon-cutting ceremony, not a press release, just a community dinner. Word had spread slowly, intentionally. A few families came from town, some retirees with more stories than teeth. A teacher recovering from cancer, a widower who'd stopped attending church but still baked the best pies. One woman arrived with a duffel bag and a nervous son who clung to her leg. They didn't ask questions, they just opened the door. The long dining table, once a cold monument to wealth and decorum, now held mismatched plates and warm casseroles. There were chairs from 5 different eras, a tablecloth too short for the length of the wood, and a makeshift banner above the fireplace that read in bold hand-drawn letters, "Everyone has a story, here you can breathe." Jack stood near the kitchen, quietly watching Evelyn move through the room pouring cider, introducing guests, helping a shy girl set down her coloring books on the floor near the new reading bench. There was no trace of the polished heiress the town had whispered about. She was simply Evelyn, present, radiant in her worn jeans and easy laughter. She caught his eye and smiled. He crossed the room toward her. "You know," he said, nodding toward the crowd, "this might be the first time I've seen this house truly alive." "It was never the walls," she replied. "It was the waiting." Jack looked around. The fireplace crackled. A dog snored under the piano bench. Someone in the back began to hum softly a tune. No one knew, but everyone welcomed. "You still carving initials in stone?" he asked, grinning. Evelyn leaned in close. "I was thinking, we saved that for something else." Like what, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass plaque. The kind used for nameplates or garden benches, it was newly engraved. Jack read it aloud. "Restored with grace by Evelyn Whitmore and Jack Harper, for all who need a second beginning." His voice caught near the end. She took his hand. "Hang it when you're ready," she said. He kissed her then, not with urgency, not as a reward or a promise, just as an acknowledgement. That this home, this moment, this woman was the kind of truth he'd spent his whole life quietly preparing for. That night, long after the guests had gone and the dishes had been washed, they sat together on the back steps facing the orchard. The stars were bright above them, but not showy. The kind of stars that didn't ask to be noticed, just quietly kept the sky company. Evelyn leaned her head on Jack's shoulder. "You know what I've learned," she whispered. "What's that?" "That healing doesn't come all at once. It's 100 small kindnesses that build a bridge back to yourself." He nodded. "You built this house that way?" "No," she said, "we did." A long pause, then Jack asked quietly, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you never called me?" She smiled against his sleeve. "I didn't call you for the leak," she whispered. "I called you because I didn't know how else to come home." He looked out into the trees, the wind rustling soft through the leaves. "Well," he said, "I'm glad you did." They sat in silence after that, letting it settle around them, not as something empty, but as something earned. The kind of silence that didn't ache anymore. The kind that felt like peace. And so the house stood, still worn in places, still creaky in the morning, but full of breath and color and stories now. And in its heart, 2 people who once thought they were too broken to begin again, but stayed, built, loved, and opened the doors wide for others to do the same. We'd love to know, where are you listening from today? Whether you're in a quiet town like Marlow or halfway across the world, your presence means more than you know. If this story moved you, made you feel something, or simply brought a moment of peace, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. There are many more heartfelt stories waiting to be shared with you. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.